Throughout history, there were a number of queens of Britain and England who were subjected to harrowing and shocking treatment in the moments after their deaths. One of the greatest queens, Elizabeth I, is often referred to as Gloriana, due to her prosperous reign, but the Tudor queen did not want her body embalmed after her death. But this was ignored, and her internal organs and her heart were cut from her corpse against her wishes. Her body and remains were also later moved from their original place of interment, but we view Westminster Abbey today as one of the main burial sites for the British monarchs. However, during the medieval period, and for over 400 years, the body of one queen was actually left unburied and was subjected to a huge amount of desecration, and her corpse was even kissed by one of England's most famous writers. In their own right, the queens featured in this documentary all had their remains disturbed and their burial chambers opened for sometimes the wrong reasons, and they were not allowed to rest in the manner that was intended for them. To support our channel, please subscribe. Inside of Westminster Abbey, for over 400 years, a Queen of England was left unburied. Royal burials were usually huge, spectacular events. For example, the funeral of Elizabeth I, which brought an end to the Tudor period, was huge and incredible. Henry VIII's funeral, for example, even had to see roads being widened for it to pass by, and he would then be buried inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Henry VIII wanted to be interred in a huge tomb, but this would never happen, as the tomb was never finished by his children following his death. But Henry VIII's great-grandmother would be subjected to a harrowing afterlife in which her corpse and remains were treated terribly after her death. Catherine of Valois is remembered today for being the Queen of England, who was left unburied for 400 years inside of Westminster Abbey. But what is the story of her harrowing treatment? Catherine of Valois was the queen and wife of Henry V of England, the warrior king who was said to have been one of the greatest to ever rule over the nation. Henry won spectacular victories against the French at the Battle of Agincourt during the 100 Years' War, but negotiations occurred to marry the English king to Catherine, who was a French princess, and the plan was to combine the two thrones of England and France, with the future children and heirs being the king of both nations. But when Catherine was pregnant with her second child, her husband, Henry V, became very ill, and he was sick. At this time, Catherine was just 21 in a foreign country, and she was now a dowager queen and was the mother of King of England and France, Henry VI. Catherine was now a wanted woman, and she was seen as a possible wife for many nobles because they wanted to be the power behind the King of England, the child of Catherine. But she did have a relationship with Owen Tudor, the keeper of her wardrobe, and they later got married and they had many children. It was this that gave the Tudor family the links to the throne that they would later exploit. However, on the 3rd of February 1437, after giving birth, Catherine of Valois died. She passed away from complications from childbirth, and she'd been ill for a while and had even gone to Bermondsey Abbey for prayer and possible treatment. But Catherine was given a huge funeral, despite the scandal with her marriage, and she was embalmed and her internal organs were removed after death to prevent decay, and then her chest cavity was stuffed with spices and herbs. Catherine's body was then wrapped in a thick and heavy material cerecloth, which was dipped in wax, and her body was then encased in lead before it was placed into a wooden coffin. The organs of Catherine were removed and they were then placed inside of different jars and boxes, and they were buried in different locations to the rest of her body. During the funeral procession, an effigy showing Catherine of Valois was placed on top of the coffin, and it showed the Dowager Queen dressed in her fine clothes, and this was painted to look as realistic as possible, and it shows Catherine as a tall woman with blue-grey eyes. The wooden effigy was, for many, the first time they'd seen any image of the Queen and former wife of Henry V. But Catherine was then given a second funeral service, on the 8th of February 1437, 5 days after her death, and she was laid to rest in an alabaster tomb in Westminster Abbey, close to the tomb of her husband, Henry V. Now this could have been the end of Catherine of Valois' story and account in the history books. However, she would then, for the next few centuries, be subjected to a horrific ordeal. The tomb she was placed in was temporary, as Henry VI, her son, wanted to make a huge memorial for her, but he died before this could occur, and Henry VI had also been deposed during the Wars of the Roses. But Henry VII, Catherine's grandson, would then demolish the old Lady Chapel where she was buried, and he planned to build a new one which would become a big Tudor mausoleum. However, during the work, the tomb of Catherine was destroyed, and Catherine of Valois' body was unearthed as new foundations of the chapel were dug up. Catherine's wooden coffin, which had been interred below ground for around 50 to 60 years, had been decaying, and the wood had rotted a lot. Her remains were then taken out of the coffin, with the coffin being opened, and they were even taken from the lead-lined inner coffin. Her remains were then placed into a wooden chest, which was then covered over roughly with lead from the old roof of the chapel. This new coffin or box, containing the former queen's remains, was then laid near to the feet of her husband's tomb, and it would be left there unburied for around 300 to 400 years. Henry VII may have ordered this to distance himself from his relatives and Catherine's scandalous marriage to Owen Tudor. He said that, "In our monastery at Westminster rests our noble progenitors and blood, and specially the body of our great dame of right noble memory, Queen Catherine, wife to King Henry V, our body therefore to be buried within the same monastery, that is to say, in the chapel where our said great dame lay buried." It seems he envisioned the Lady Chapel as a family tomb for all the Tudors. But Henry VII died before the Lady Chapel could be finished, and his successor, the infamous six-wived king Henry VIII, did not bury his great-grandmother Catherine of Valois. Neither did any of the other Tudors. The chest she was put inside of had a lid in 2 parts, and people would be shown her remains if they paid a small fee, and tourists came into Westminster Abbey and even pulled back the cerecloth showing her face. It was said that the bones being firmly united and thinly clothed with flesh, like scrapings of tanned leather, and visitors to the abbey said she had bare skin and was buried naked with no clothes, except for her cerecloth shroud. Some tour guides even made money from this, and Catherine of Valois was becoming a morbid tourist attraction. Lots of people who witnessed her body would go further, though, and they would flock to Westminster Abbey to even touch and at times kiss her body. The famous London writer and diarist Samuel Pepys even kissed her corpse, and he wrote on this: "On Shrove Tuesday, 1669, I to the Abbey went, and by favour did see the body of Queen Catherine of Valois, and had the upper part of the body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth, reflecting upon it, I did kiss a queen. And this my birthday, I 36 years old, and I did kiss a queen." So people would flock to the abbey to kiss the corpse of the queen, and this became a tradition. But there was much more further horrific actions taken against her life, and it was said in the 18th century that her body had been ripped to pieces by a group of young scholars. It was said the queen's body was a shapeless mass of whitish colour, and it had much stolen from it. People had taken her teeth, and some of her bones would later be taken. However, in 1788, the remains were placed inside of a vault for around 100 years. But then during the reign of Queen Victoria, her vault was opened and people broke in to see if her body was really there in the Villiers vault. But they found the remains of her on top of a pile of coffins, and the wooden coffin of Catherine of Valois had been placed inside of, yet again rotted, and it was in a bad way. It had stuck to another coffin, and the people managed to free it, but when it came out into the air, the wood perished. However, when Catherine's body was looked at again, there was a lot missing. Some said it had been covered in lime and several parts of it had decayed, and the front part of her skull had gone missing, and one part of the back of this was found lying on her pelvis. A lot of her backbones had been stolen. as were all her ribs but one, along with 2 of her arm bones. Souvenir hunters had taken a lot of her remains, and her legs were found in perfect condition, still wrapped in the 12 layers of cerecloth which preserved them hundreds of years later. The coffin was replaced, and her remains were then placed into it. A witness who saw it being carried into Henry V's chapel said, "It was a striking and impressive scene which I shall ever remember, and which at the time it was impossible to view without some feeling of emotion. The daylight had quite faded, and we were alone in the darkened abbey. 2 workmen took up the box containing the Queen's remains, and followed Mr. Poole and the clerk of the works, the latter carrying in his hands 1 small lantern to light us, led us way out of St. Nicholas's Chapel to the north side of the Chantry Chapel. Mr. George Scarfe and myself followed. No one else was present, and we seemed unconsciously and silently to fall into a sort of processional order. I remarked to him, 'We are attending the Queen's 3rd funeral.' Not a word was said as we passed slowly round the ambulatory in the darkness. Her remains inside of a thick English oak coffin were marked by an inscription showing the bizarre journey her remains had been on. They built a new tomb near to the altar, and in Henry V's chapel her remains were laid to rest 400 years finally after the death of Catherine of Valois. The inscription marked, 'It is the latest royal tomb in the abbey, and though long delayed, it has been thought that the singular and romantic history of a French princess and an English queen should at length be brought to an honourable end. Requiescate in pace.' Catherine of Valois' body and remains were subjected to a horrific treatment in the years after her death, and people even kissed her decaying remains hundreds of years after she succumbed to death. It was a horrific thing, and people inside of Westminster Abbey even tried to make money from the unburied Queen. Yet she never deserved this, and she was a queen who was not given any respect following her death. One of the most shocking executions of the Tudor period was when a young teenage girl during the reign of Queen Mary I was executed inside of the Tower of London. This young girl is often regarded as a queen and is remembered in history as the 9-Day Queen. Lady Jane Grey's demise inside the Tower of London is shocking, and she lost her head at the sharp end of the axe. She was allowed a private execution within the walls of the fortress, unlike her husband, who was dragged out onto Tower Hill, where his head was hacked from his shoulders. But after Jane's execution, she was then taken into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the Tower's chapel, and she was then buried inside of the same place where 2 of Henry VIII's wives and other countless important Tudor people were interred following their executions. But during the reign of Queen Victoria, efforts were made to exhume her, and there was a search for her. Lady Jane Grey became the Queen of England following the death of her cousin, Edward VI. The former Tudor king and son of Henry VIII had named Jane his successor to keep his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth off the throne. But Jane was taken to the Tower of London in the July of 1553 following her proclamation of Queen to await her coronation. But it was the eldest daughter of Henry VIII, Mary, who would depose Jane, and she rose up inside of her nation, and she caused a significant rebellion to the point where the Privy Council switched their support to Mary. The effect of this was that Lady Jane Grey, the young teenage Protestant 9-Day Queen, was deposed, and the place where she was to await her coronation then became her prison. Her husband was also imprisoned, Guildford Dudley, and he was a man who dreamed of being made king by his wife. But Jane continued to refuse this during her short time on the throne. Jane was charged with high treason, and her trial took place at the Guildhall on the 13th of November 1553, and a special commission was to deal with her charges on behalf of Queen Mary I, who is of course also known as Bloody Mary. She was found guilty, and Jane's guilt was established as she assumed the title and the power of a monarch and she signed some documents as Jane the Queen. But she was then sentenced to be burnt alive on Tower Hill or beheaded as the Queen pleases. But there was a belief after this that her life was to be spared by the new Queen Mary, and this was the perception that emerged after. But the major problem with Jane's fate was that she remained a threat to the Catholic Queen Mary's crown, and when a pro-Protestant rebellion emerged across England, it was clear that Mary would deal with her teenage cousin once and for all. She decided to sign the death warrant, and her execution was scheduled to go ahead on the 9th of February 1554, but it was postponed for 3 days, as Jane was given a chance to save her life if she converted to Catholicism. But Jane did not do this, and because of this she would be executed 3 days later. On the morning of her execution, she witnessed her husband Guildford leave the Tower for his execution, and she then also witnessed her husband's headless corpse returning back inside of the Tower for burial. And she screamed out when she saw this. It was shortly after this that Lady Jane Grey was summoned from her chambers for her execution. There was a scaffold inside of the Tower where she was led towards, and when she reached the scaffold she claimed, "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by the law I am condemned to the same. The fact indeed against the Queen's Highness was unlawful, and the consenting thereunto by me. But touching the procurement and desire thereof by me or on my behalf, I do wash my hands thereof in innocency, before God and the face of you, good Christian people, this day." This speech was remarkable, and it's considered that she was either 16 or just 17 when she was executed by an axeman who stood armed with his weapon of death. She admitted to her crimes, and she asked the executioner to dispatch her quickly, and she prepared herself. A blindfold was placed over her eyes, and then when she went to reach out for the block, she panicked, and a witness then helped her find her way to the block. And in one savage and quick strike from the axe, Lady Jane Grey was executed. Following this, her remains and head were then buried inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. This was close to the scaffold, and she was buried in a quick and hastily dug grave near to the altar. But let's remember that Jane was a Queen of England, and she did possess royal blood, meaning that it's most likely that she was buried close to the altar, which was said to have been reserved for prominent people. No memorial stone was placed on her grave, but during the Victorian time, work occurred inside of the chapel. There were renovations made because it was deemed that the chapel was not fit enough of a place for the burial of queens, and Jane was buried alongside Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, as well as others such as Margaret Pole, who possessed royal blood. But the work which was carried out included the floor of the chapel being lifted, as it was said to have been uneven, and because of this there was a significant amount of exhumation ordered of the burials near to the altar. The coffins of these people had decayed, and a huge number of burials were found inside of the chapel. But a remarkable number of burials were found. One of the most significant was the burial of Anne Boleyn, and Queen Victoria's physician was brought in to identify the remains of her, and he confirmed that this was Henry VIII's executed second wife, and she had lost her head in a dramatic fashion, and the remains of Anne were found just 2 feet down. The bones had piled in one spot, and the amount of investigation into Anne's remains was remarkable. However, there was more work to do inside of the chapel. It had been recorded that Lady Jane Grey and also Catherine Howard had been buried inside of the chapel nearby too. The search was on for Lady Jane's remains and body. However, it's claimed that a number of prominent Tudors were buried on the west side of the chancel inside of the chapel. Work was not specifically being carried out here, and it was here where the remains of Lady Jane Grey were found. What is surprising is that her remains were discovered as she was just a young girl, and one thing to consider is the age of her when she was executed, as her bones may have not fully hardened as she was a teenager. It's expected that her bones may not have stood the test of centuries, leading to the possibility that she was buried rather decently inside of a coffin. What is also interesting is that Jane was buried close to her husband, or next to him, and that Queen Mary I did bury her with significant dignity, allowing Jane to be buried next to Guildford, and also near to her father-in-law. This was something Henry VIII, Mary's father, would not have permitted. For example, his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, had her remains covered in quicklime to literally wipe her off the face of England. It is believed that Jane's body may have been placed inside of a new lead casket, and that this was then held inside of the Queen's house for some time inside the Tower, whilst works were being carried out. Her body, if this was the case, would have been held in the same rooms as Anne Boleyn and other executed figures, before it was then reburied close to the high altar, with the lead casket having a plaque on that carried the name of Jane. There have been a consideration that the bones of Anne Boleyn could have actually been Jane, but this is debated also. Still, today Lady Jane Grey is buried inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, and she was laid to rest a short distance away from where she lost her head. She was around 16 years old when she was brutally executed at the hands of Queen Mary I, or Bloody Mary, but it looked like she would be spared during her life, and it looked as if she would have escaped with mere imprisonment. Jane was someone who did not want to be queen, neither did she ask for it. The crown was thrust upon her in a religious solidification of the English Protestant Reformation, but her fate was horrific. One of the most iconic yet greatest queens ever to rule over England was the final Tudor monarch, Queen Elizabeth I. She, during her decades in power, oversaw a huge time of change in which there was a huge boom in culture. Writers such as Shakespeare were making a name for themselves, and Elizabeth would also manage to see off a number of threats to her throne. A lot of people across England did not want the Protestant Elizabeth as their queen, and they preferred to turn to Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic former Queen of Scotland, to rule. Because of this, Mary was embroiled in a number of plots against the life of Elizabeth, and the Tudor Queen dealt with this once and for all by ordering her execution. As Mary, Queen of Scots' head was taken clean off by axe, but she also defeated the Spanish Armada, the most feared and notorious fleet and army of the time. But Elizabeth was a queen greatly beloved by her people, and many could not imagine a world in which she did not rule over them. But as the year 1603 came, Elizabeth I was not as glorious as she once was, and she was a woman who was giving up on her life, and she was coming to terms with her own demise and death. However, she would be buried in a huge tomb, eventually. But this was broken into, and what those who did this found was shocking, strange, and incredible. In the early morning of the 24th of March 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died. She was, by the standards of the Tudor period, a very elderly lady, and she had lived and ruled for many decades. But she was then succeeded by the Scottish King James, who was invited to come and dual rule England and Scotland, meaning the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of the Stuart dynasty. This would have greatly upset her father, Henry VIII, who at one point even barred the Stuarts from the throne. But Elizabeth had been ill for many months, and her health was getting worse, and many people around her were beginning to believe that the end of her life was near. She was a woman who had survived many of the deadliest diseases of the 16th century, and she was afflicted, for example, with smallpox, and her face still bore the scars of the brutal disease. But in her final days, Elizabeth I was depressed, and often for long periods of time rather vacant, and she seemed long in thought. It's believed she was contemplating many of the decisions she had took as Queen of England, including ordering the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, another anointed queen, and she was concerned that this would prevent her from one day getting into heaven. She was concerned about what was next, and the Queen was almost 70 when she did eventually die. In her final days, she was accompanied and waited on by her servants and closest friends, as well as when she took to the deathbed the Archbishop of Canterbury. He promised Elizabeth not to worry, and she would go to heaven, and that she would rule one day again as a queen in heaven. She was also told her close friends had died, would be waiting for her, and that she should remain close to God in her final moments. But her final moments were hard, and her throat swelled up, and speaking was a problem. But the Queen then gave up her fight against the illness that proved to cause her death. Inside of her private bedchambers within Richmond Palace, Queen Elizabeth I died, and she gave a number of instructions as to what should happen next following her death. It's well known that Elizabeth did not like the thought of being disemboweled and having her internal organs removed and then buried away from her body. But this was tradition for monarchs of the time, and despite Elizabeth saying she did not want this to happen, doctors and physicians ignored the request. Elizabeth's body was cut open, and her heart along with other organs were removed, and then her cavity was stuffed with spices to stave off decay. This eventually was a good thing to have happened, as during the funeral procession, the movement of the coffin on the procession may have caused the body of Elizabeth to explode, as violent gases emerged out of her body and even splintered the coffin. This subsequent posthumous explosion would have been worse without the embalming process. But Elizabeth was, following her death, left inside of a lead-lined coffin which was decorated with many Tudor images, including roses inside of Richmond Palace, before the procession to Westminster Abbey began. This was a journey which had a number of steps. The coffin of Elizabeth was taken down the River Thames on the royal barge to the Palace of Whitehall. Her coffin had been draped in black velvet, and it was kept a close watch on by 6 of Elizabeth's ladies. It was said that during the procession on the River Thames that the oars at every stroke did tears left fall, and the people of London were gutted about losing their queen. But the Queen's body had been wrapped tightly in the coffin in cerecloth when the alleged explosion took place, but her remains regardless continued to Westminster Abbey, and on the 28th of April 1603 the funeral procession occurred to Westminster Abbey. It was said by onlookers that the city of Westminster was surcharged with a multitude of all sorts of people in their streets, houses, leads and gutters that came to see the obsequy. There was as such a general sighing, groaning and weeping, as the like has not been seen or known in the memory of man. The coffin of Elizabeth I was decorated with a large effigy of her on the top, which was dressed in her Parliament robes, and on top of the effigy was the crown of the Queen. Her hands held the sceptres of power, and the effigy was made from wax and also wood. But this was one of the first times that the people of London had seen their Queen and what she looked like, as portraits were not readily available to the poorer people. The coffin was pulled by 4 horses, and when it arrived at Westminster Abbey, yeomen of the guard carried it into the church for the funeral service. The funeral of Elizabeth I was conducted by the Dean of Westminster, Dean Andrews, and after the funeral service, the coffin was carried into the Henry VII Lady Chapel. Her body was lowered into the same vault as Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, her grandparents, at the heart of the Tudor mausoleum, showing the respect that the people of England had for their Queen. This was a huge honour, and was seen as a fitting tribute. However, in 1607, a number of years after her death, the body of Elizabeth I was moved, and her coffin was brought back onto the surface of the earth. James I, her successor, ordered that Elizabeth's coffin should be moved to be placed under a tomb which had been crafted showing her, but he also said that she should be buried in this new vault with her sister's coffin, sitting directly below her, symbolising how Elizabeth was much more significant in her reign to Mary I, who was also known as Bloody Mary. The tomb of Elizabeth was huge and large, and she was laid to rest in a room opposite Mary Queen of Scots, James I's mother, and 46 shillings and 4 pence was paid for the removal of Elizabeth's body and the subsequent reburial. The tomb today is still spectacular, and Mary still today is buried underneath her half-sister. But in the 1800s, the burial vault of Elizabeth was broken into by curious members of Westminster Abbey. In 1880, a book was published by the Dean of Westminster, Arthur Stanley, who had been given special permission by Queen Victoria to explore the vaults and burial vaults of Westminster Abbey in order to create an inventory as to what was actually inside. He was looking in particular for the coffin of King James I, and he discovered this in the original burial site of Elizabeth I in the burial vault of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. But then Stanley was exploring other rooms off the royal vault, and he explored an aisle underground at the east end of the tomb of Elizabeth I, and he found a small opening in the walls. He crept through this and then entered the burial vault of Elizabeth I, and he noticed the 2 coffins which were in this. There were no other coffins, and the sanctity of the Tudor Queen's remains had been respected for centuries. Arthur Stanley wrote what he saw when he broke into the burial vault of Elizabeth I. The excavations, however, had almost laid bare the wall immediately at the eastern end of the monument of Elizabeth, and through a small aperture a view was obtained into a low, narrow van lit immediately beneath her tomb. It was instantly evident that it enclosed 2 coffins, and 2 only, and it could not be doubted that these contained Elizabeth and her sister Mary. The upper one, larger and far more distinctly shaped in the form of the body, like that of Mary, Queen of Scots, rested on the other. There was no disorder or decay, except that the centering wood had fallen over the head of Elizabeth's coffin, and that the wood case had crumbled away at the sides, and had drawn away part vault of the decaying lid. No coffin plate could be discovered, but fortunately the dim light fell on a fragment of the lid slightly carved. This led to a further search, and the original inscription was discovered. There was the Tudor badge, a full double rose, deeply but simply incised in outline on the middle of the cover. On each side the august initial E.R., and below the memorial date, 1603. The coffin lid had been further decorated with a narrow moulded panelling. The coffin case was of inch elm, but the ornamental lid containing the inscription and panelling was of fine oak 1/2 inch thick, laid on the inch elm cover. The whole was covered in red silk velvet, of which much remained attached to the wood, and it had been covered not only the sides and ends, but also the ornamented oak cover, as though the bare wood had not been thought rich enough without the velvet. The sight of this secluded and narrow tomb, thus compressing in the closest grasp the 2 Tudor sisters, partners of the same throne and grave, sleeping in the hope of resurrection. The solemn majesty of the great Queen thus reposing, as can hardly be doubted by her own desire, on her sister's coffin, was the more impressive from the contrast of its quiet calm with the confused and multitudinous decay of the Stuart vault, and of the fullness of its tragic interest with the vacancy of the deserted space which had been hitherto explored in the other parts of the chapel. The vault was then immediately closed. This was the last time that the burial vault of Elizabeth I was opened, and this is the clearest account as to what it looks like to this day. There may be other times in which the burial vault was opened, however this is not known about, and still today the remarkable tomb of Elizabeth I marks the very site where just underneath the floor the brilliant final Tudor Queen lays to rest. Queen Victoria, the iconic ruler of the UK and Britain, died inside of her bedchambers. Her bedroom, despite being small, was filled with mourning members of her family, many who were weeping heavily, and there were many people inside of this room who would one day play a role in the outbreak of the First World War. But Victoria's family believed that she would never die, and they thought she would live forever, and they did not take her final illness well. Victoria herself was a woman who had a deep affinity with death and had remained in mourning for her husband, Prince Albert, for decades, following his early and shocking death. But the British public also had not known anything different, as Victoria had ruled for almost 64 years, and at the time this was longer than any other monarch in British and English history. But secretly, as the doctor made preparations for her body after her death, and they prepared to place this in the coffin, he and one of the Queen's dressers would sneakily carry out the final wishes of Victoria, and they had a number of items placed inside of her coffin. Many of these would have caused great offence inside the royal family, but this was Victoria's final wish. But what was inside the coffin of Queen Victoria? And these items are still there today, alongside the remains of the Queen in the Royal Mausoleum in Frogmore. Queen Victoria's death took many people by surprise, but it was clear to the royal doctors that the Queen in the year 1900 was rather ill, and that she was actually suffering. She had a number of rough months following a number of close deaths, and she went to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and whilst here she was pushed around in a wheelchair and struggled to see as well. She passed away at 6:30 in the evening on the 22nd of January 1901 at the age of 81. With her were many members of her family, including her children and successor, Edward VII, along with the Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. After she passed, her favourite pet, her dog, was placed upon her deathbed, and then instructions for her funeral were dug out and the mourning period began. But there was a lot of chaos, as no one had any experience in planning a royal funeral, and with this there was a lot of arguing between the Lord Chamberlain and other members of the family. Victoria had stated that for her funeral she wanted a military ceremony befitting the daughter of a soldier, and as she was the head of the armed forces, she wanted a huge military presence. She also indicated that she wanted people to wear white instead of black, but a number of calamitous problems then arose. The first of which is the most laughable, was that when the royal undertakers were summoned from London to the Isle of Wight to prepare her body, and then to collect it and bring it back to the English mainland. But they actually forgot the very coffin that Victoria had made years or decades before, and a local craftsman was then ordered to create the coffin that the Queen would be buried in. Queen Victoria had, though, made a number of secret requests to her doctor and close friend Dr. Reed, who she knew would be the one who prepared her body inside of the coffin, and she also informed one of her dressers to help in this. The pair had been given a number of specific instructions as to items that needed to be placed inside of her coffin, and some of these items would have caused a significant degree of offence to the royal family. The first request was made by Victoria that she wanted a plaster mould and cast of her late husband, Prince Albert's hands, to be put inside of the coffin. Albert died in 1861 when he was 42 years old, and the Queen never recovered from his loss. But she wanted his hands to be with her inside of the coffin until the end of time. Dr. Reed also placed one of Albert's dressing gowns inside of the coffin, and this was a garment that her husband wore to bed often, and these were insisted upon by Victoria, and they were a romantic gesture linking the Queen to her deceased love. These were both rather normal items for a woman to be buried with, and she also asked for her wedding ring to be placed inside of the coffin, and this was then placed on her ring finger. But also, Victoria was dressed with her lace wedding veil over her face, and she wanted this as she had kept this from her wedding day, and she wanted her white veil to symbolise that she was reunited with the love of her life, and this was seen as a release from the mourning and grief that she had been plunged into for decades. The veil was said to have been the end of her sadness, but many other pieces of jewellery and jewels were placed on her body, and she wanted as much jewellery on her body as possible. A ring was placed on every one of her fingers, her neck was covered in necklaces, and she had a lot of bracelets on her wrists. Victoria also stated she wanted a cape that her dead daughter Alice had made for her husband when she was young, and Victoria was very close to Alice, who had died in 1878. She was the first of Victoria's children to die, and this broke Victoria's heart. She also asked for a small bouquet of Scottish heather to be placed inside of her coffin, to remind her of the times in the Scottish Highlands in Balmoral.
However, many of the requests made by Victoria would have caused a huge amount of upset to members of the royal family. You see, throughout her reign following the death of Prince Albert, Victoria grew close with a servant who was Scottish. He was called John Brown, and many historians have investigated their relationship, and it's believed that the pair did love each other. And Brown was a no-nonsense man who would not hide from telling the Queen something she would not like. And he was one of only a few select people who the Queen would listen to, and he served as the master of her horse, and the pair went on a lot of walks together. He even saved her from serious injury during a carriage accident, and many believe that Victoria did love Brown. Some have even claimed that the pair may have got married, but this hasn't been confirmed. They were very close, but John Brown was not the most popular with the children of Victoria, and was said to have been uncouth and too firm, but Victoria loved this about him. And after Victoria's death, Edward VII, her successor, even removed many of the memorials Victoria made to John Brown following his death. Victoria, in secret, had told her doctor that inside of her coffin she wanted placed was a lock of John Brown's hair that she had secretly kept for decades, and this was passed to the doctor, and he did this. She wanted part of her close companion with her in death, and she then also demanded a picture of Brown to be placed inside of the coffin. However, the most scandalous request that Victoria, for some reason, had the wedding rings of John Brown's mother, and she wanted this to be placed in her coffin, and this was one of the rings placed on her finger. The significance of this is that John Brown's mother may have passed the wedding rings on to Brown for him to give to a woman who would take his hand in marriage. So did Brown give the rings to the Queen with the intention of marrying her? A priest on his deathbed in Scotland claimed that he even married Queen Victoria to John Brown, but this has been disputed. But Victoria wanted to be buried with this ring. It was not a ring made of jewels like the Empress of India could have had. It was a simple ring, a ring made cheaply, but it had a huge amount of significance for Victoria. Victoria wrote about Brown's death saying, "Brown was the best, truest heart that ever beat," and she would also write that he had no thought but for me, my welfare, my comfort, my safety, my happiness, courageous, unselfish, totally disinterested, discreet to the highest degree, speaking the truth fearlessly, and telling me what he thought and considered to be just and right, without flattery and without saying what would be pleasing if he did not think it right. The comfort of my daily life is gone, the void is terrible, the loss is irreparable. If the royal family would have found out about Dr. Reed placing this ring on her finger, they would have been furious, as they brought into question the idea of Victoria marrying Brown and casting Prince Albert in a different light. But Dr. Reed and the dresser continued to work on her body, and they then prepared her remains and placed the lid of the coffin on. Inside of the coffin were many of the Queen's most treasured items, and those who related to many of her most treasured people, including her husband, children, and possible love. Victoria's funeral was one which did not go ahead without incident, as there were a number of calamitous mistakes, including the funeral carriage even bolting off at one point, and it was then pulled by sailors. But inside of the coffin, the doctor and dresser did well, adhering to her wishes despite the chaos that was emerging outside, and they tastefully recognised what the Queen wanted, as opposed to her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who cast a death mask of her face against her wishes. These items still remain inside of Queen Victoria's coffin today.